Henry VIII took the throne in 1509 at just 17 years old. And before you picture the bloated, red-faced tyrant from every history textbook, understand that version of Henry came later. The young king was genuinely extraordinary by any standard. Over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, athletic. He could speak Latin, French, ancient Greek, and Spanish. He played the lute and the organ, composed music, wrote theology. Foreign ambassadors who met him were almost embarrassingly impressed. His own subjects gave him a nickname, Buff King Hal, which tells you everything about how his people saw him in those early years. He was the Golden King, the Renaissance prince England had been waiting for. Every morning he was up and out hunting. He jousted not just for ceremony, but because he genuinely loved the violence and speed of it. He danced, he gambled, he threw celebrations that went half the night. His court was loud and alive and the center of everything happening in England. But here's the thing about courts, they are never really about the king. They are about the 1,000 people who live inside the machine that surrounds him. And that machine, underneath all its ceremony, was genuinely horrifying. Start with the basics. Hampton Court Palace, one of Henry's most beloved residences, had 55 rooms dedicated just to the kitchen. 55. 200 kitchen staff worked those rooms to feed the 600 courtiers attached to the court, producing meals that ran up to 14 courses a day. In a single year, the royal household consumed around 1,240 oxen, 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, and 1,870 pigs. The food was extraordinary, whole roasted peacocks served with their own feathers reattached after cooking, beaks painted in gold leaf. On Fridays, when the church band meet, the kitchen served grilled beavers' tails, because someone had decided that since beavers lived near water, they counted as fish. Whale meat was on the menu too. These were real dishes served at a real table. Now here's where it gets grim. Henry VIII, the king, was actually forced to issue a formal royal decree banning his own kitchen staff from working naked, or in clothes so filthy they had become a biological hazard. Cooks were sleeping on the kitchen floor next to the fires. The decree had to instruct palace clerks to go out and buy the kitchen staff actual clothing, because the people preparing food for the most powerful man in England apparently could not be trusted to show up dressed. That is not a rumor. That is a documented royal order. And that was just the kitchen. Outside it, across the wider palace, the sanitation situation was genuinely medieval in the worst possible sense. Human waste collected in underground chambers until it could be physically carried out. Men urinated so regularly against the garden walls that Henry had large red excess painted on the worst spots as a deterrent, which backfired completely because it just gave people something to aim at. Dishes were dumped in hallways. The scholar Erasmus visited an English noble dining chamber around 1520 and described the floor as covered in clay and old rushes concealing what he called an ancient collection of grease, bones, spittle, and the excrement of dogs and cats. He was describing the place where noblemen sat down to eat. The reason for all of this wasn't stupidity. It was scale. Over 1,000 people were attached to Henry's court at any given time, and their combined waste, bodies, animals, food, fires, made any palace uninhabitable within days of arriving. Henry's solution was to keep moving. He owned 60 residences across England. The court would settle, the palace would become unlivable within a week, and they would pack up and relocate while the previous one was scrubbed down. In July of 1535, the court travelled through roughly 30 different locations over 4 months. Not as a royal tour. As a sanitation strategy. Now let's talk about the women. Because this is where the court stops being merely unpleasant and becomes something genuinely chilling. To be a woman in Henry VIII court was to live inside a system where the highest rank available, Queen of England, was also the most dangerous position in the country. Henry married 6 times. 2 of those wives were executed. Let that sit for a second. The man had 2 of his own wives beheaded. Catherine of Aragon was his first wife. They were married for nearly 24 years. She was discarded because she couldn't produce a male heir who survived. Her replacement, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536, charged with adultery and treason. Most historians today believe those charges were invented. Henry was engaged to his next wife, Jane Seymour, 11 days after Anne's execution, and at Hampton Court, Anne's name was physically chiseled out of the stonework. Her heraldic badges were stripped and replaced with Jane so fast it must have felt like watching someone erase a person in real time. Jane Seymour gave Henry the son he wanted and died shortly after childbirth. She was the only one of his wives to receive a full Queen's funeral. Then came Catherine Howard, around 17 years old, married to a 49-year-old king in 1540. She had been positioned into that marriage by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, as a political play. She was executed in February 1542. She was buried in the same unmarked ground as her cousin Anne Boleyn, two cousins, the same end, a few years apart, in the same church floor at the Tower of London. But the story that really tells you what this court did to people is Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. She had served 5 of Henry VI's wives. She had watched, survived, adapted, made whatever compromises she needed to make. She was executed the same day as Catherine Howard, condemned for helping facilitate Catherine's private meetings. By the time of her arrest, she had suffered what contemporaries described as a complete mental breakdown while imprisoned in the Tower. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you: the government's response was to pass a brand new law specifically permitting the execution of the insane for treason, so that Jane's mental state could not be used to spare her life. They changed the law to execute a woman who had lost her mind. That is the Tudor court in a single act. Ladies-in-waiting lived in that same shadow. Close enough to royalty to absorb its danger, disposable enough to be sacrificed without consequence. The court was full of informants. One wrong conversation, one allegiance misread, one letter intercepted, and the line between attendant and liability was already crossed. Now here's what happened to the man running all of this. Henry's body and mind began falling apart after a jousting accident in January 1536 at Greenwich Palace. He was thrown from his horse, which reportedly landed on top of him, and lay unconscious for 2 hours. The court genuinely thought he was dead. He wasn't. But the person who woke up was not quite the same person who had mounted that horse. The fall worsened an existing leg wound that would never properly heal. Pus-filled ulcers formed and kept getting infected for the remaining 11 years of his life. He went from a 32-inch waist to 52 inches within a decade. He had to be lifted onto horses and eventually carried through his own palace in a specially made chair. By the time he died in 1547, he weighed close to 400 pounds. What changed alongside his body was harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Historians still debate the exact cause: traumatic brain injury from the fall, a rare genetic disorder called McLeod syndrome, type 2 diabetes, the cumulative weight of pain and power. Whatever it was, the court after 1536 became genuinely unpredictable in a way it hadn't been before. Advisors who had been trusted for years found themselves arrested for offenses that would have been ignored a decade earlier. His temper, which had always been there, lost its internal pattern. Nobody could predict what would set it off. And when you can't predict what will set off the most powerful man in the country, every single day becomes an exercise in controlled fear. That is what it actually felt like to live there. You performed constantly. You dressed correctly, laughed at the right moments, disappeared at the right moments. You watched the king's moods the way sailors watch the sky before a storm. You ate gilded peacock at banquets that were more political theatre than meals. You breathed air thick with smoke and animal waste and the cologne people wore to cover what they couldn't wash off. You woke up the next morning and walked back into it. And in the back of your mind, always, was this one fixed fact: the man at the center of all of it had executed 2 of his own wives, destroyed a 24-year marriage on a whim, split England from Rome for a son, and sent people he genuinely loved to the scaffold without visible remorse. Henry VIII Court wasn't just a place. It was a living system built around one man's will, and it rewarded the people who understood that survival meant never, ever forgetting it.